Could the fight over vaccine mandates send state lawmakers back to work early in a special session? Plus, passing the torch as liberal woman breaks a barrier facing Latino politicians in Southwest Kansas. But first, school board races with never-before-seen levels of partisan bickering. What happens now that the polls are closed and winners declared? That's what we're talking about right now on Kansas Week. This is Kansas Week, and I'm your host, Pilar Pedraza. With an unprecedented amount of party backing and national dollars poured into their races, conservatives fared well this week, taking over many school boards across the state. So now what? KAKE's Jackson Overstreet takes a look at what's ahead for these new school board members who campaigned on one or two topics, but will have to make decisions on many others.
Changes are coming to the Wichita School Board.
Thank you for all your support.
The three board members-elect, Diane Albert, Kathy Bond, and Hazel Stabler, say they're ready to get to work on issues that got them elected, like the district's mask mandate.
Because we need to bring common sense values back to our schools. We need to allow parents to make the decisions that are best for their students.
But first, like the students they'll now be in charge of helping, the next few weeks will feature a lot of studying about the board.
I think there's a lot to learn, a lot of background that I don't know, and that will be a priority.
Board President Stan Reeser says that attitude is exactly what the three will need to get started.
Give them as much information as they can handle, as much information as they need, and as much information as they want.
Reeser says after this last election featured some of the most partisan campaigning for school board, now is the time to move on and focus on the kids.
Partisanship adds a new dimension to it, but it's not impossible to overcome when people who have the best intentions come together and start working for students.
He says having three new members offers a chance for new voices to be heard on the board, something he calls exciting.
This next couple of months will be just getting to know each other. What are some of their priorities?
And joining me today to discuss this week's elections and other topics, we have former Sedgwick County Election Commissioner Tabitha Lehman and political analyst Dr. Neil Allen Fox. Dr. Neil Allen, sorry.
That's all right.
It's been a long day. Dr. Neil Allen from Wichita State University. And joining us by Zoom, we have another political analyst, Dr. Michael Smith from Emporia State University. Welcome all of you, and I will try to get names right through the rest of the show here. Michael, as we're looking at this, this was an election unlike any other when it comes to the partisanship of local races. Is this something we're going to see sticking around?
That's an excellent question. It sure is breaking new ground. Whether it's good ground or not, time will tell. I think the quote you just played saying you can still govern a school board this way is true. We have judges in some counties in Kansas elected on a partisan ticket, and they still do their job as judges. But I think the bigger concern is not just the partisanship, but the issues. Mask mandates, vaccinations, which children are now eligible for one of them. These used to be considered uncontroversial measures taken on behalf of public health that had nothing to do with politics or partisanship. School boards are to order textbooks, to partner with teachers, to celebrate when the football team wins, and to kind of set the direction, help with learning outcomes, things like that. And so I'm actually more concerned about the issues that are being raised. And then there's the whole false claim about critical race theory being taught in the classrooms too.
And talking about the impact of the issues being raised in these races, shortly after the election was determined, Mays Schools Superintendent Chad Higgins announced that he was resigning effective end of the year. Now, I've been hearing rumblings that may be the first of several districts where we see similar top-level officials resigning as these new, more conservative school boards come in, perhaps an effect of the campaigning that we've seen?
You could say that, although being a school superintendent in any situation with any school district is a really, really difficult job. And also, what we have now is partisanship in elections without the kind of organizing structure of parties. And so the Republican Party, a little bit nationally and a lot locally and on the state level, decided to play in school board races around here in Wichita and Andover. And there's also some action in Mays as well and some other places. But a lot of it was about mask mandates and vaccine requirements, which are very important things for schools that take up a lot of time and money and effort. And critical race theory, which really doesn't. And so, so it's going to be a really interesting couple of years at least, as a lot of people who campaigned on stopping something that frankly most schools don't do anything about, and then they have to figure out, okay, how do their values motivate them to try to work on things like, how do you pay your staff, how do you keep your kids safe, and how do you try to get them so that they can read, write, and think critically well enough to work and be citizens in their adult lives. And sadly, I just don't think our campaigns right now are helping us sort these issues out.
Well, moving from the issues of the campaigns to the results of election night, Tabitha, before we began recording, you were talking about there are some really interesting stories in the numbers that we saw coming out of election night, especially in the write-in numbers.
Yes, I noticed that election-wide there were about 3,800 write-ins reported on election night. Of course, we don't know who those people were that were written in, just that a write-in occurred, but that about 1,800 of those were in one race in the Goddard School District, and that amount, it's not likely that one person got all of those write-in votes, but given the percentages and the amounts that some of the other candidates got, it's entirely likely that one of the three, because it was a vote for three, some of those people could be knocked out of the race by a write-in candidate who won.
And how unusual is that?
You know, it's not, I wouldn't say it's unusual in smaller races, but to see 1,800 write-ins when you already had, I think, what was it, 6 or 7 candidates on the ballot? I mean, I was just glancing at it. It's not like I was conducting the election this time, so I don't remember exactly how many candidates there were, but that's a large number of write-ins for that race for this type of an election, and that really jumped out at me as I was looking at those results.
Yeah. Well, and I know that there was another one that I noticed, a smaller town, and I can't for the life of me remember the name of the town right now. But one of the smaller towns, and they had kind of a similar thing where there was, in that case, actually, it was like about 350 or so write-ins, I think it was, and that was more than all of the other votes for all of the other candidates combined.
Well, and in those cases, you would assume that somebody was running an actual write-in campaign, and I don't know in Goddard School District. I would assume maybe that was the case, but it'll be interesting to see after canvassing what we find out as far as who actually won those races.
And that is the case. We will find that out with canvassing here in a few more days.
Right.
All right. Well, other things from this election to discuss. It was a changing of the guard of another sort in Southwest Kansas as liberal voters picked a Latina to represent them for the first time ever. Cake's David Scott introduces us.
Very honored. I'm very humbled, and I just hope to inspire more people.
Janeth Vasquez has done something no other Latina in Southwest Kansas has managed: win an election to represent her community. She was one of 6 candidates from Liberal looking to fill 3 seats on the city commission. She didn't just win a seat, she was the top vote getter. Vasquez says the biggest surprise for her is not so much her win, but that the word first is now attached to her name.
It's shocking to me considering the population in Southwest Kansas. The majority of these towns are 60% higher Latinos. So it's shocking.
A naturalized citizen, Vasquez teaches U.S. citizenship classes and preaches civic responsibility to her students.
If we are not happy with the current situations in our towns, then that's where we have to come in and step in and try to make change. At the end of the day, it starts with us.
Vasquez says she's wanted to get into politics since she was 5 years old. The only thing holding her up, a promise to wait until her mother could vote for her.
I always said the moment that my mom becomes a citizen, that's the day I'm going to run. So this was her first time voting, and she cast her vote for her daughter.
And before we start recording, a quick note. You are well known for mentioning when you have a conflict of interest on this show. In this case, it's my conflict. I know Janeth. I worked with her at a previous job, and that is part of why we saw David doing that story and not me. But she had kind of an interesting point there. You know, 60-some% of the population in several western Kansas towns are Latino, but we're just now starting to see them make inroads into politics. Is there something about the voting system, do you think, that holds them back, or is it a cultural issue?
You know, I wouldn't, of course, I'm going to jump to defending the voting system. That's just kind of my default there. I wouldn't think it would necessarily be the voting system. It may be some of it. I mean, I'm not well versed in some of these areas. It could be some district boundary lines. It could be as far as how the districts are drawn, diluting a vote there. It could also just be, some of it could be language barriers, depending upon the location of whether things are provided in Spanish or in the languages that would make it easier for them to vote. So I think some of those things could be part of it.
Yeah. And those were a lot of the issues that we saw brought up in the 2020 election, Neil, with the furbelow that came up about the Dodge City voting.
That's right. And also, in a place like Western Kansas, particularly in the meatpacking towns like Liberal, Dodge City, and Garden City, you have voting arrangements that have neutral reasons that can have non-neutral effects. And so those counties tend to have county commission seats that divide up this county seat among 3 or 5 districts, which happens to divide up the Hispanic and Latino population into districts. That's probably not the reason for it initially, but it does it now. And also, there's another thing about partisanship that matters here, is that, that traditionally Hispanics and Latinos vote for Democrats. That was less true in the last couple of elections. And also, when it comes to like state legislature, then the districts that include those towns are extremely Republican right now. And that's mostly because of white voters, but it's also because the Latino vote, which is the base of the Democratic Party there, is full of people that are younger, so they're less likely to be eligible to vote. And also, they're people who don't necessarily have the same kind of social networks that citizens do who have lived in these areas for long periods of time.
I will say that a lot of the numbers about Latinos voting Democrat are really not very reliable from what I've seen, and Latinos tend to be as much socially conservative as they may be fiscally or otherwise liberal, and so there's really kind of a split in the Latino community as to which direction it should go.
Yeah, that's right, and also that American politicians are realizing that you have to go out and work for every kind of voter in every situation, because when you write people off, then you pay for it later.
Yeah, yeah, and Michael, we talk about this, talking about the populations that we see, especially growing up around these meatpacking plants in Western Kansas. You've got a similar setup there in Emporia.
Yes, that's exactly right. And for years, there have been those working to engage the Latinx community here with mixed results. There's one Latino member of the Emporia School Board, and that's it for elected officials. The communities are very tight-knit, a lot of family members looking out for each other, but also a lot of distrust and even, I'm afraid, some sense that voting may make one vulnerable to various reprisals and so forth. So it's a bit of a battle. This population has notoriously low voter turnout rates. So this is good news in Liberal, and we hope to see more of it.
And certainly this story getting a lot of attention. So moving on, along with city council and school board elections, Kansas voters made decisions on several other issues this week, from sales taxes to how many people would represent them. 54% of voters in Reno County this week decided to expand the county commission there from 3 to 5 members. The expansion was planned for 2023 because current commissioners wanted voters to elect the new members, not have the governor appoint them, as would happen if they took office sooner. There is some question, though, from the county councilor if they can legally wait that long. He told the Hutch News legally the expansion happened when voters approved it. Meanwhile, 57% of Salina voters said they wanted to limit city powers to restrict businesses and citizens during an emergency like the pandemic. And several cities voted on various sales tax hikes, often approving them. Great Bend voters approved 3 sales tax increases, one to raise money to replace the police headquarters. Another 2 will fund the police and fire departments, including their pension plans. And Andover voters decided to pay for a new fire station. And this is one of many issues when we have these local elections. You get a lot of these little local questions. Let's start with Reno County. They've got this new county commission. They wanted to wait until couple of years to look at adding those two next members, but now there's some question about that. That could cause issues as far as quorums and times when they might need a supermajority.
Yeah, and in Reno, they've actually had a lot of issues involving. They had one of their commission members. I can't remember whether it was either passed or he was unable to serve anymore. You know, a 3-member county commission is a difficult thing because also you've got a 2-member majority there. I come from Indiana, where we mostly have had 3-member county commissions, and the open meeting rules basically said the 2 of them can't go and talk about the work, just the 2 of them in private, because then you violated rules. And so I think, you know, I know that voters don't like the idea of adding more people to government, but I think the basic number for county commissions in Kansas really needs to be 5, and you move it up to 7 for a big place like Wichita, and because just 3, it's a lot to ask for 3 people to sit as the county health board, the county water board, and to make all the decisions that need to be made so that people can still live their lives.
And as we look at that list, also a lot of sales tax issues there. Was that a normal amount, an unusual number from your experience? Do you usually see a lot of sales tax questions on these local elections?
I think a lot of times, whether it's a school bond or a sales tax, there's some preference, and I may get myself in trouble with some friends here, but there's some preference to put it on an election that has lower turnout because you're more likely to get it passed. So, and I don't know any of the people who put these questions on about it. I'm not accusing them of anything, but I'm just saying that it does tend to be something, you know, like for City of Wichita, when they've put things on the ballot, they kind of tend to put it more on an even-yeared election. But we've certainly seen.
And also they then lose.
Yes, yes,
yeah.
that's a valid point. That is a valid point.
But they lose because the voters didn't want that sales tax for those particular things. So it's how democracy is supposed to work. But, you know, process creates outcomes.
No. All right. Well, let's move from the election to the state legislature. Some lawmakers now calling for a special session to decide how to respond to federal vaccine mandates, which some call federal overreach. Rebecca Chung of the KSN Capitol Bureau explains.
Lawmakers generally meet here at the Capitol for a few months each year, but there are talks that they may come back early to try to block the federal vaccine mandate. And this comes as thousands of Kansans are set to lose their jobs next month.
1, 2, 3.
Kansans pushing back as the deadline approaches for people to get fully vaccinated. December 8th is the date. At least 3 universities in the state threatening to fire workers who don't comply.
Our universities would just as soon fall in line and do what they're told by this administration than to make it a process by which people can be exempted by this.
There are people that do not act responsibly. The responsible thing to do when you're trying to avoid disease is follow the medical advice.
On the national level, Kansas Senator Roger Marshall is joining efforts to stop frontline workers from losing their jobs if they choose not to get vaccinated.
For folks who, for personal reasons, have decided that they don't want the vaccine, I don't think it should be mandated by the federal government.
And in Kansas, hundreds of protesters are speaking out against the mandate, pleading with lawmakers for something to be done. Now a plan is on the way as some lawmakers on the state's Government Overreach Committee scramble to find a solution.
I believe if you want to get the vaccine, you should get the vaccine, and if you don't, you shouldn't be forced to. The goal of the committee is to look at what we can do as a state to protect Kansans' freedoms and rights.
Now, the small group of lawmakers studying this issue will be getting back together next week to look at options, and one of those options could include calling a special session to pass state legislation, but we'll have to wait until next week to get a firm answer. At the Capitol, I'm Rebecca Chung.
And I've been hearing a lot from my sources about the possibility of a special session. Michael, as we look at that possibility, we do know it takes a 2/3 vote of lawmakers to make one happen if the governor doesn't call it, and I don't see the governor calling one in this case.
That is an excellent point. And let's not forget, too, that politicians sometimes take these stands primarily to get on the record in preparation for the next election. So do they really want to stop the federal mandate, or do they want to be quoted in the news media as opposing it? Particularly those Republicans going into their Republican primaries, where they've got to look to their right and they've got to look at the possibility of being primaried by someone even more conservative than they are.
Well, taking that issue that Michael brought up, that lawmakers will often make these stances in order to get their names in the media and et cetera, getting ready for the next election. We're definitely seeing that with Derek Schmidt and Governor Laura Kelly in this last week as regards federal mandates. Thoughts?
Well, one of the things I think is going to be interesting to see is if the legislature actually can even do anything about this, because this is not a normal, this is coming through OSHA, and so this is not. I'd be interested to see if there is even something legally that they can do, which would tend to point towards it may be more political posturing than anything else, if they know they can't actually do anything legally.
Yeah, it would seem that the lawsuits that have been filed would be more effective.
I could see that, although that much of the federal government's policy runs through states, and also the people like most of the Republican Party here in Kansas who want the federal government to stop having these kind of mandates. They have lots of allies in Washington, and those allies, like Senator Marshall, have a lot of power because of the way rules work in the U.S. Senate. And I mean, I'm just afraid on the issue of vaccine mandates for employers, including mine, where it's very confusing to try to figure out who is covered, when are they covered, the question of what to do about a student worker that makes $100 doing research on the side. Do they need to actually prove their vaccination status? I mean, sadly, I think there's too much confusion, and I really don't think we're going to get any relief from Washington or Topeka on the confusion for a while. But this is what happens when we elect sets of politicians with mandates that are inconsistent with each other. And I just think it's going to be a really tough, 2 or 3 months to figure out.
Yeah. All right. Well, it's going to be interesting to watch and see how that happens, because really not much we can do from this desk. Well, one lawmaker isn't working this week. He took a week away from his legislative duties after being arrested last weekend for a domestic disturbance. It's an arrest that has many calling for his resignation again. 21-year-old State Representative Aaron Coleman from Kansas City faces domestic battery charges now over a disturbance involving his brother. Thursday, the freshman Democrat announced on Twitter he's taking a leave of absence following a judge's order Monday that he undergo a mental health evaluation. He also called the arrest a case of frivolous prosecution. Last February, a House committee reprimanded Coleman over allegations he abused girls and young women before taking office, including multiple incidents he admitted to, saying he was a troubled teenager. Last month, the Kansas Department of Labor banned him from their building over allegations of disruptive behavior. This latest incident has led to several calls this last week for Coleman to resign, from the Kansas House Minority Leader to 6 women serving in the Kansas House and a statewide domestic violence organization. And Michael, again, this is more from your neck of the woods here. This is a story that's kind of been playing out ever since Coleman was running for office. There have been multiple calls for his resignation from the very beginning. Do we see any different reaction this time than we've seen before?
No. There's a popular bumper sticker in the Kansas City area. It says, "Kansas City, Kansas, it's not for amateurs." Wyandotte County has a really close-knit, kind of a unique political culture. It's rough and tumble. It's democratic, but it's kind of rough. They're kind of proud of their reputation. Coleman beat an establishment candidate, and the Wyandotte County establishment needed to be shaken up. His behavior is absolutely unacceptable, but even though Coleman's political views are similar to Bernie Sanders, his personal behavior is more like Donald Trump. And believe it or not, in his district, that combination plays pretty well. Not one of the people calling for his resignation is from Wyandotte County, and I wouldn't be surprised if he got reelected.
Interesting. And there also have been calls for the legislature to kick him out. Doesn't really happen very often, though, does it? I certainly don't remember it happening in my time covering the state legislature.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very difficult thing to do because the people are actually hired Aaron Coleman, and the people of his district in Wyandotte County decided that he was the one that they should have to represent them. And so kicking a sitting legislator out of the legislature, sorry about that.
It's a Friday.
Yeah, then that's, I mean, that's very complicated if you don't want to overrule the will of the people. And Tabitha, I mean, you ran elections, here in Sedgwick County for, the best part of the last decade or more. Like, did you get calls from people whenever there were various kinds of issues involving politician bad behavior and asking, to get rid of them?
Oh, it was demanded of me multiple times that I remove people from office. I had to explain to them that I thankfully did not have that kind of power. And then we would go through the recall petition process, explaining all of that. But yeah, I mean, I certainly heard from my fair share of people who were angry sometimes over things that was just something as simple as a vote they didn't like, but most of the time it involved actual behavioral issues.
And on this case, I in my position as a nonpartisan analyst and also a college professor at a state college, I generally don't advocate any candidate or person not having their job. But in this case, it's hard to see how this representative can do any work representing their constituents whenever they don't have relationships with anybody in the legislature that's good, that their time is taken up dealing with legal problems that they've caused themselves. And maybe this is a different one than all the things you listed, because this happened while he was in office, and would violate the standard code of conduct for all of us, because beating people is not allowed without cause. And it would just be better for all concerned if he would resign and let the party committee pick somebody so that the people of Wyandotte County can have the representation they deserve.
All right.
Well, and I think it's a situation where it should be, I personally believe that our lawmakers should be held to a very strict, high standard, and there are lots of cases where this comes up. And
we're going to have to leave that there because we are out of time. I am sorry to interrupt you. Thank you, Neil, Tabitha, and Michael, so much for joining us. We'd also like to thank our new Cake News, KSN News, and the Wichita Eagle for sharing their materials with us. For now, stay safe and have a great week.